So the indomitable golden boys of the Adeptus Custodes are very strong in Warhammer 40K right now, but within their ranks, who are the best of the best? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Adeptus Custodes, and in this video I thought we'd take a look at the strongest units that they have to offer. Adeptus Custodes are having a pretty great time of it in Warhammer 40k Arcs of Omen right now. They really have had quite a few things go right for them. A bunch of their stratagems got de-restricted so they can use them multiple times a game again. The Emperor's Chosen being able to access a staggering amount of rules at the drop of a hat is pretty nice. They gained objective secured on a few key units, cheap assists of silence, and many competitors got nerfed at the same time as Marines getting better, and in general Custodes tend to be quite good against Marines with all their damage to weapons. Tournament data does seem to have them doing very solidly indeed, around about a 55% win percentage, with plenty of lists placing highly at big events. They also look to be the most commonly played competitive faction right now, perhaps partly due to ease of access, only having to paint up a small amount of models, plus a rather nice Christmas Battle Force box that they just had a month or so back. With that in mind, I was kind of interested to see what sort of units Custodes lists are running right now to do so well. In this video, I thought we'd talk through some of the most commonly played choices, why they're good and what makes them strong, and just for a bit more data as to what people are actually running in these top lists, I took a look at 25 high-performing Custodes lists, either going 4-1 or better at a grand tournament, or 3-0 at a small local tournament. Should hopefully be a little bit more selective for the Custodes lists that are doing kind of well. And I thought for this video we could go through in terms of order of percentage selections, the amount of times each of these units appeared in at least one list. Definitely not the only way that you can do a top 10 type video, but for this one I thought it would just be a helpful metric to see what real people are playing. Let's get into it then, and before we jump into the top 10 proper, here are some of the lesser played units, things that didn't come up all that much in the armies that I took a look at. With no selections at all, we've got a bunch of slightly niche Forge World stuff, the Custodes Flyers, the Forge World Bikers, the Coronis Grav Carrier, and the Standard Guardians with the Adrathite Spears. And also the Custodes HQ section seems to be kind of closed to the standard Custodes captains on foot, either the standard one or Valerian didn't turn up at all. I can see why that's the case, to be honest. Trajann Valoris and the bike captain seem to generally do what they do better by a bit. Otherwise, very rarely picked, we've got the Blade Champion, Knight Centuria, Psychina Rhino, Palace Gravatak, Allied Armiger Helverins, Vigilators, and Aquilon Custodes, the alternate Terminators. All of these do seem to be pretty rarely picked in Custodes armies, even though I feel like most of them are pretty usable. Say for example, the Psychina Rhino having a bunch of Witch Seekers jump out, the Blade Champion's really not a bad countercharge threat, and the Knight Centuria provides the Sisters of Silence psychic debuffs but on a character protected model, which is kind of handy. Still though, the average list isn't running very many of any of these. Finally, a bit more prominent and not far out of the top 10 are these ones. For the Dreadnoughts, we've got the standard venerable one from the Codex, the Contemptor Achillus, and the Telemon Heavy Dreadnought. It does seem that with the changes to the infantry, Dreadnoughts are just a little bit more out of fashion, and all of these seem to be heavily outcompeted by the Achilles. Caladius tanks were kind of popular in Nephilim, but not so much now, it would seem. Only 4 lists had some of them. 4 lists took a Shield Captain and Terminator armor, most often to make use of that interesting Presidium plate relic with the big heroic intervention maneuver, and 5 lists took along some Witch Seekers for the Sisters of Silence. They do seem like a pretty decent alternative to standard Bolt Assisters to me, a lot more damage for 1 extra point, plus the pre-game move. All of these ones seem okay to me, but out of these selections it looks like most people just take 1 or 2 of them, and don't take most. Finally, one more bonus mention before the top 10 in general. In 11th place on the list we have Prosecutors, just out of the running, at least 1 unit of them appearing in 8 selections out of 25 armies. These are the standard Bolt Assists of Silence, 11 points per model, and these are the ones in the troop section, so they do get objective secured. It seems that people are still slightly preferring them to the Witch Seekers for the majority of lists. I guess they are the cheapest unit if all you want to do is camp an objective. Objective secured is quite nice to have, I guess, compared with the Witch Seekers for that role as well. And against Psychers, you could play them really quite differently. Maybe put them a lot more far up the field to actually get their debuff on the go, or potentially shield your army for a turn worth of smite. I didn't see any list that ran more than 2 units, and typically they're just running small units of 5 without transports. Handy enough for small units to do objectives and actions, I suppose. Into the top 10 now, and in 10th place we have the Custodian Wardens. 9 lists chose to at least run 1 squad of these, and now I feel like they're really quite a viable alternative to the standard Custodian Guard. The major reasons that you didn't want to take them before are kind of gone. They've got objectives secured, and you no longer need to absolutely ROM troops choices in your army if you don't want to. And I'd argue that the damage and defensive profile for the Wardens is pretty comparable with the standard Custodian Guard. They cost 5 points more, but they do get their feel no pain plus an extra attack. It's going to make the Wardens better in some situations, but the standard Custodians better in others. I feel like perhaps for this list in particular, there's a bit of an element of different units kind of competing against each other for the same role. Just about every single Custodes list either had these Sagitarum Custodians or Custodian Guard in. Basically your choice of your favourite flavour of custodian bodies on the battle line to hold down objectives and things. In terms of the units that people chose to ran, most people chose to ran small-ish units of 3 to 5. Both Axes and the Guardian Spears seem to be pretty viable. And there was that notable list that won the Uprising Adelaide tournament with 2 enormous blocks of 10 Wardens. That was kind of fun to see. Overall a very solid unit with a standard Custodian profile. Strength and toughness 5, 3 wounds, a 2+ save and a good invul, and a bunch of damage to close combat weapons. I feel like a lot of the core strengths of the Custodians army are applying their very flexible buffs and character benefits to these guys or Custodian Guard. And I guess these guys might have a little bit more help in protecting characters that you're running up alongside. Maybe one trade-off against the Custodian Guard is that they get shields and these guys don't. Maybe that was enough to encourage a few more people to run the Guard rather than the Wardens. Moving onwards and upwards, in 9th place we have the Vexilla Praetors. I've counted the standard one and the Terminator one the same here, as they're basically just 2 different versions of doing the same thing. These guys seem to be at least fairly balanced, plenty of lists are running them, but plenty of them aren't. A nice to have little standard banner that gives you some toughness against enemy shooting. The 2 popular ones were the Vexilla Defensor for the light cover aura, good with those 2+ saves, or the other one was the Vexilla Magnifica, a -1 to hit for the nearby core units. That one's quite nice if you happen to be firing against very high AP shooting. Things like Meltify will care about this more. Beyond that, he's a character who isn't too terrible in combat, got a fairly standard Custodian stat line with his damage 2 Guardian Spear. He can use a Custodian Terminator teleport home stratagem if desired, and is a reasonable choice for taking certain relics like the Castellan's Mark, the one that allows you to redeploy other units. Generally wants to be moving up alongside the Custodes battle line, units like Custodian Guard, Wardens, or potentially the Jetbikes if they can snag into his aura. He can also protect the core Dreadnoughts as well. Moving on, in 8th place we have the Sagitarum Custodians. These are your standard foot custodians with guns. They're a Forge World choice for 50 points per model. They have the standard Custodian stat line with the toughness 5 and 2+ save. Their main weapon is the Boltcaster, generally a heavy bolter profile plus an underslung combi weapon that's a disintegrator beam. That one's close range and strength 5 and damage 3. They're really quite nice to have on the battle line. There were a couple of lists that went really quite heavy on them, lots of big squads. They seem to be particularly good for Emissaries Imperatus when you can advance and shoot for no penalty whatsoever. And even though they are mainly range focused, it's not like they're absolutely awful in melee either. They still get their 4 attacks at strength 5, AP -2 with the Misericordia. Not at all bad for dispatching to hold some slightly further flung objectives so they can still contribute to the damage game. And some people run a mix of both these and either Wardens or standard Custodes. The general plan being for these ones to be the second wave as opposed to the first wave with the melee weapons. Next up in 7th place we've got the Forge World Contemptor Achillus Dreadnought. 12 of the list took 1 or more of these. They seem to be quite often fielded in pairs, so that is around about half the list that I looked at. In total 14 of the lists took some sort of Dreadnought, so basically if Dreadnoughts were on the field they almost all tended to be this guy. He is pretty generally dangerous, moves a fairly fast 9 inches, is pretty tough to kill with toughness 7, 9 wounds, a 2+ save, 5+ invul, -1 damage and a 6+ feel no pain. There are quite a lot of barriers to getting any wounds on him. When he shoots, he's got a couple of anti-tank shots at strength 8, AP -2 and damage 3. In combat he attacks with a Dread Spear at a massive strength 14, AP 3 and damage D3+3. With 6 attacks that's going to leave a mark on just about any heavy. And then he's got a secondary weapon, either some Lastrum Stormbolters or some twin Adrathic Destructors. More seems to take the Lastrum Bolters, though a couple upgraded to the Destructors. Eternal Penitent is quite relevant for this guy as well. That's the pre-game upgrade stratagem to get an extra attack and re-roll charges. That one seemed to be at least fairly commonly taken. And these are quite nice for Emperors Chosen in particular, I think. A single re-roll really coming in handy both with their shooting and combat. Overall a very scary Dreadnought, though I feel like maybe a few less lists running him in Arcs of Omen, what with a bunch of the infantry getting better. Next up, in joint 5th place with another unit, we have the Custodian Guard. Half of the armies chose to take at least some of the standard issue Custodians with the Guardian Spears or the Shields. It does seem that people think that they're just pretty efficient as a unit, as they're in a codex where now you don't have to take any troops, and there's also decent other good OBSEC units around as well. Their main weapon options are the Guardian Spear for strength 7, AP 3 and damage 2 in melee, plus some auric weapon style shooting which can have a few buffs like the Salvus Catar, or they can swap it out for the Sentinel Blade, shorter range in shooting, lower strength in melee, but that also gets you the shield as well, giving you a +1 to your save, particularly hard to remove in cover. Again, for the most part, people generally tended to run these in small units of 3, though a few lists built out to a few more and supported them with characters and stratagems and things. The shields do seem at least fairly popular, though maybe not have every single model in a unit running them. Often it tended to be, say, have 1 or 2 shields in the unit, and then 1 or 2 Guardian Spears. Again, I feel like these might be just a little bit diluted compared with Wardens. The vast majority of these had either these Sagitarum or Wardens in to hold the battle line. They're kind of close in terms of numbers of selections, though it seems that the Custodian Guards slightly win out over the Sagitarum and the Wardens. Tied with them and also taken in 13 out of the 25 lists are the Venatari Custodians. These guys seem to be coming back with a vengeance since the OBSEC changes. They're the Forge World winged custodians with the jump packs, and are quite cheap as well at 55 points per model for a vastly faster moving custodian model. These guys basically get some decent close range shooting that's AP 2 and damage 2, either out of their kinetic destroyer pistols or their Venatari lance. And then between the two loadout options, you have the choice whether you want better defense by taking the Tarsus Buckler. That one gives you the 2+ save but only damage 1 melee, or if you take the Venatari Lance, then you get an extra attack and damage 2 melee, but you don't get a 2+ save, just a 3+. I feel like the trade-off is pretty close, to be honest. It does seem that there's no major consensus at competitive units being run here. Some like the spears, some like the bucklers and pistols. In general though, since these guys picked up objective secured, they seem to be running really quite a lot in competitive lists. In general they were kind of niche before, kind of outcompeted by the Vertus Praetors very heavily. It does seem that they're now popular enough that at least a fair few top placing lists seem to be building around the fast attack section for the Arcs of Omen detachment, taking a bunch of these and a bunch of Vertus Praetors. Often lists that picked them up were running 2 or 3 units of them rather than just one, and I can see why, to be honest. Basically a fairly similar threat to a standard Custodian Guard between their shooting and combat, but getting it done far faster and just for 5 points more. Speaking of jetbikes though, and going way up in the world, we've got the Vertus Praetors. A really big jump in numbers of selections here. The Custodian bikers were run in 20 out of the 25 lists looked at, so seem to be pretty much in almost auto-include territory. 80% of the lists chose to run these. The big golden bikers are some of the most efficient fast damage dealers in the army. 80 points per model, though usually 85 if you pick up the salvo launcher. Most people seem to prefer that over the Hurricane Bolter, a single shot at strength 8, AP -4 and damage D3+3. Those get on very well with a single reroll for the Emperor's Chosen as well. Then their profile's ridiculously quick at 14 inches. They're pretty tough at toughness 6, 5 wounds and the 2+ save, and just generally pretty brutal in melee with 4 attacks, getting a +1 to wound with their Interceptor Lance, which strikes at strength 7. They do have a few downsides, not getting objectives secured when all the infantry do, and there's a bunch of stratagems that you can't use on these guys. But still, for a brutal damage dealing unit to take the fight to the enemy, you could certainly do worse. It's not uncommon to see a whole bunch of these winging around the board, accompanied by a Dawneagle Jetbike captain. In third place, and just ridiculously improved compared with where they would have been if I made this 6 months ago, here are the Allarus Custodians. The Custodian Terminators perhaps seem to be the biggest winners of the big OBSEC handout. I think perhaps because they're kind of interesting as a unit in the first place, as you can field really small units of them just of one model. But even then, just one Custodian model is enough to be a threat to many lighter enemy infantry units, and these guys can get into really quite annoying places, teleporting in out of golden light. The Terminator stat line is 60 points per model. They've got 4 wounds and 4 attacks with a Guardian Spear or Axe, and they've actually got some fairly heavy shooting as Custodians go as well. The auric weapon profile on their main gun, plus a fairly savage grenade launcher with D3 shots at strength 5, AP 3 and damage 1. It is kind of impressive just how many army lists are choosing to run these now. Typically I'd say the most commonly picked combo is 2 individual units of one of these. It does depend a bit on the flavour of the Arcs of Omen detachment chosen for the Custodes. It either tends to be elite or fast attack. If it's elite, then you can often take a few of these and spam them. In general, just having 1 or 2 come down to skirmish with enemy light infantry, take objectives, and maybe do things like behind enemy lines seems like a really quite a good idea. A few lists did take some bigger squads of them though, though even then they often weren't enormous, usually just in units of 2 or 3. In any case, nice to see these return as an actual credible unit for the army, rather than one that was just flat out classed by other things. Giving them back their Auspex did seem like a fairly reasonable move. In second place, it seems that we're finishing up with the HQ section, and here we have Trajann Valoris, who was taken 22 times out of 25 lists. It does seem to be the common thinking that if you're running a competitive Custodians army list, you're probably taking Trajann Valoris along. Kind of funny that he's still so auto-include, now he's up at 200 points when he went down to 160 at one point. He does bring an awful lot of value to the table, and is far more popular than the shield captains on Fortor and Terminator armor, as we mentioned earlier. The Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes brings really quite a lot to the table. He's got a pretty mighty combat profile, with 6 attacks with the Watcher's Axe at damage 3, and he's got the Moment Shackle when he's fighting, giving him one of 3 different buffs. Basically, between the 3 of them, it ensures that he will get some value out of it before he dies. He's fairly tough to kill with 8 wounds and a 5+ Feel No Pain type save, plus the option to negate a save if he uses the Moment Shackle for that. He hands out some nice rerolls to hit and wound for the Custodes, often pretty good when they're usually hitting on 2s anyway, and often wounding on 3s. And to cap it all off, he also helps out with your command points as well. You start on the board with extra CP, and you have the Warlord trait to allow him to regenerate them on a 5+. Overall, seems to be fairly universally acknowledged that he does enough for his points to justify his inclusion. A very common sight stomping up the board, alongside a bunch of troops Custodians of one flavour or another, or maybe some Wardens, and maybe having some Jetbikes nose into the reroll aura for a turn as they move up. Finally, winning out on this list was the shield captain on Dawneagle Jetbike. I'm perhaps not too surprised to see this guy ranked all the way up here. He seems to be in pretty much auto-include territory within the HQ choices. Every single one besides one list decided to run a Dawneagle Jetbike, taking Trajann Valoris and a Terminator captain instead. The captain on Jetbike basically does what the Vertus Praetors does, but on a character model. A really nice combo of both very fast, very tough and very dangerous, and also buffing the Jetbikes that he flies around with. It's got toughness 6 and 9 wounds with a 2+ save, pretty spectacularly tanky for a character choice, more akin with a light vehicle kind of stat line. He often adds to that as well with a 5+ Feel No Pain type save from a Warlord trait. That would probably be my first choice to run with him, though you can double up on Warlord traits if you want to with a stratagem. Otherwise, he's got his shooting. At least a few people decided to take the Hurricane Bolters over the salvo launchers to give him a little bit of threat against infantry, though salvo launchers still seem to be the most common. And in combat he strikes with 6 attacks with that Interceptor Lance, and when he's on the charge he'll usually be re-rolling hit rolls of 1 and wound rolls of 1, as he gets that buff for just 15 points for the Tip of the Spear Captain Commander trait, which is pretty much an auto-include. It seems that only one list wanted to pay an extra command point to take one as a heroic support choice. I can see why, to be honest. I feel like after you've taken Tip of the Spear and the 5+ Feel No Pain trait, the next one's probably in diminishing returns. Still though, this guy's just big and threatening enough so that your opponent can't really ignore him, and also can't really get out of the way that easily when he moves 14 inches. Overall, it seems like in competitive Custodians lists, this guy is the single most auto-include out of any of the models. Typically people like to run him plus Trajann Valoris, and then other characters beyond those two are a bit more take or leave. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed a bit of a discussion around some of the top Custodians units and what makes them good in the current game. Let me know your experiences with these units and which ones you'd be most tempted to run down in the comments below. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, and if you'd like another Adeptus Custodes video to watch, I'll link my review of them in the new Arcs of Omen rules down in the video description. Feel free to check it out. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description below as well. The channel's Patreon page is what allows me to keep all these videos coming quite so regularly on Auspex Tactics, so if you are enjoying a lot, any support is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.